Put down that box right now, or I will have the police drag both of you out of this house in handcuffs," my Aunt Beatrice shrieked, her face twisted in pure malice. She stood in the grand foyer of my late grandfather Arthur's estate, flanked by her husband Richard and their spoiled 24-year-old son Julian. My mother, Sarah, clutched a dusty photo album to her chest, tears streaming down her pale face as she looked at her younger sister. My grandfather had passed away just 3 days prior after a long and brutal battle with dementia. My mother had been his primary caregiver for 10 long years, sacrificing her career, her social life, and her own health to ensure he spent his final years in comfort. Beatrice and her family had barely visited once a year, always claiming they were too busy with Richard's business or Julian's expensive private school events. Yet, here they were, standing in the center of the estate with a stack of legal documents and sneers on their faces. I stepped in front of my mother, my chest tight with a mixture of grief and burning rage. "You have no right to talk to my mother like that, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice steady but lethal. "Grandfather's body isn't even cold yet, and you are already here trying to scavenge like vultures." Richard stepped forward, adjusting his expensive watch with a smug grin that made me want to smash his teeth in. "We have every right, Leo," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your grandfather signed a new will 6 months ago, and under its terms, this entire estate, including all financial assets, belongs to us." He tossed a stapled document onto the mahogany console table near the door. The document stated that my mother was to receive a measly $10,000, while the house, the investments, and the family businesses were left entirely to Beatrice and Julian. My mother gasped, dropping the photo album as her knees buckled. "No, that cannot be true," she sobbed. "Arthur told me himself that this house would be ours, that he wanted us to be secure after he was gone. He knew how much we sacrificed." Julian laughed, looking around the expansive foyer as if he already owned it. "Well, old people say a lot of things when their brains are rotting, cousin," he sneered, looking directly at me. "The paperwork is legally binding, so I suggest you pack your cheap belongings and get out of my new house by Sunday night." I stared at the document, my mind racing as I looked at the signature at the bottom. The handwriting was incredibly shaky, barely resembling my grandfather's strong, elegant cursive, and the date was indeed from 6 months ago, a time when my grandfather could barely remember his own name. They had taken advantage of his advanced dementia to make him sign a fraudulent will, and they were now using it to throw his devoted daughter onto the street. With a heavy heart, I helped my sobbing mother to her room and began the painful process of packing up our lives. The estate was massive, filled with decades of history, and my grandfather's private study was the one room Beatrice had forbidden us from entering. She had locked the door, but she did not know that I had a spare key my grandfather had given me years ago for emergencies. Late that night, while my mother was asleep and the house was dead silent, I slipped into the study with a flashlight and a cardboard box. I wanted to find some of my grandfather's personal diaries or photographs before Beatrice took everything and threw them into the trash. I bypassed the main bookshelves and went straight to his massive, hand-carved mahogany desk, which had been in our family for 3 generations. I began emptying the drawers, finding old fountain pens, tax documents from the 90s, and empty envelopes. As I pulled the bottom drawer completely out of its tracks to check behind it, I noticed that the wooden cavity inside the desk seemed shallower than it should be. I reached my hand inside and felt around the back wall, my fingers brushing against a small, metal latch hidden in the dark. I flicked the latch, and with a soft click, a false bottom popped up, revealing a hidden compartment lined with red velvet. Inside the compartment lay a thick stack of faded letters tied together with a blue ribbon, a small black leather journal, and a sealed manila envelope addressed to my mother and me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled the items out and sat on the Persian rug. I opened the black journal first, flipping to the first page, which was dated 40 years ago. The elegant, steady handwriting of my grandfather Arthur filled the pages, and as I read the first few entries, My jaw dropped in complete disbelief. My grandfather had lived a double life. For over 15 years, he had been in a passionate, secret relationship with a French teacher named Evelyn Vance, a woman he had met during a business trip to Chicago. He had married my grandmother Eleanor out of family obligation and societal pressure, but his heart had belonged entirely to Evelyn. The journal detailed his immense guilt, his love for Evelyn, and the devastating secret that would rewrite our family history. In the summer of 1983, Evelyn had given birth to a son named Thomas. Arthur had bought them a beautiful house in Chicago, supported them financially, and visited them under the guise of frequent business trips. I picked up the stack of letters, my hands trembling as I read the letters Evelyn had written to Arthur over the years. They were filled with love, but also with a quiet sadness, detailing Thomas's childhood, his first steps, his academic achievements, and his resemblance to Arthur. My grandfather had kept a meticulous record of every single dime he had sent to Evelyn and Thomas, ensuring his secret son was well provided for. But as I flipped further into the journal, the entries took a dark, terrifying turn that made my blood run cold. In an entry dated 15 years ago, Arthur wrote about Beatrice. She had suspected his frequent trips, hired a private investigator, and discovered the existence of Evelyn and Thomas. Instead of confronting her mother or helping her family, Beatrice had used this secret as a weapon of ultimate destruction. She had walked into Arthur's office with a folder full of photographs and threatened to expose the affair to his wife, Eleanor, who was battling a severe heart condition at the time. Beatrice had demanded a massive monthly allowance, a high-paying executive job for her husband Richard at Arthur's real estate company, and a guarantee that she would receive a massive portion of his estate. "If you do not give us what we want, I will tell Mom everything, and her heart will fail," Beatrice had told him, according to my grandfather's diary. "She is a monster," Arthur had written in trembling ink. "My own daughter is blackmailing me with the life of her own mother." For 15 years, Beatrice and Richard had been systematically draining my grandfather's wealth through blackmail, using his guilt and his fear of killing his wife with the shock to fund their lavish lifestyle. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. I opened the sealed manila envelope, which was dated just 1 year ago, right before my grandfather's dementia began to rapidly deteriorate his mind. Inside was a legally binding, notarized document drafted by a highly prestigious, independent law firm that Beatrice had no connection to. It was my grandfather's actual, final will and testament, accompanied by a videotape and a USB flash drive. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop, slipped my headphones on, and hit play. My grandfather's face appeared on the screen, looking tired but incredibly sharp, his eyes filled with a fierce determination I had not seen in years. To whoever finds this, especially Sarah and Leo, my grandfather's voice echoed through the headphones. "If you're watching this, it means I am gone, and Beatrice has undoubtedly tried to use my illness to steal what does not belong to her. For years, I have lived under the thumb of my younger daughter's greed," he continued, his voice trembling with anger. "She threatened the life of your grandmother, and she has extorted millions from me. But I am not a fool, and I have kept every single piece of evidence." He held up a thick folder to the camera, showing bank transactions, signed extortion demands from Beatrice, and emails from Richard threatening to expose the secret. "On this drive, you will find digital copies of all the blackmail evidence," my grandfather said. "You will also find the contact information for my son, Thomas Vance, who is now a successful attorney in Chicago. He knows the truth, and we have been working together in secret." My grandfather took a deep breath, looking directly into the camera lens. "I have left 50% of my entire estate to my eldest daughter, Sarah, who has loved and cared for me without asking for a single dime. The remaining 50%, including this house, is left to my son, Thomas," he declared. "As for Beatrice, Richard, and Julian, I have inserted an ironclad disinheritance clause. If they attempt to contest this will, or if they present any fraudulent documents signed during my illness, All evidence of their 15-year extortion and blackmail will be immediately released to the federal authorities. I sat in the dark study, staring at the screen as the video faded to black. The sheer magnitude of Beatrice's evil was staggering, but so was the brilliant trap my grandfather had laid for her. I stayed up the entire night, downloading the files, reading every letter, and copying the financial records that proved Beatrice and Richard had extorted over $3 million from my grandfather over the course of 15 years. The next morning, I woke my mother up and showed her the letters, the journal, and the video. She wept openly, not out of anger, but out of a profound sadness for her father, who had lived in fear of his own daughter for so long. "Who is Thomas?" my mother whispered, looking at the photograph of a handsome, dark-haired man in a lawyer's suit that had been tucked inside the envelope. "Is he really my brother?" "Yes, Mom," I said, gently holding her hand. "And according to Grandfather's will, he is the co-owner of this house. We are not going to pack another single box." I immediately called the phone number listed on the document for Thomas Vance. The call connected after 3 rings, and a deep, professional voice answered. "Thomas Vance speaking." "Hello, Mr. Vance. My name is Leo," I said, my heart beating rapidly. "I am Arthur's grandson. I found the desk, the letters, and the final will." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Thomas spoke again, his voice had lost its professional coldness, replaced by a deep, emotional warmth. "I have been waiting for your call, Leo," he said. "How is your mother?" "She is here, and she wants to meet you," I replied. "But we have a major problem. Beatrice is trying to evict us using a fraudulent will she forced grandfather to sign." I heard a cold, dangerous chuckle from Thomas. "Do not worry about Beatrice, Leo," he said. "I am a corporate litigation attorney, and I have been preparing for this day for 5 years. I will be at the estate tomorrow morning with my legal team. Tell your mother she does not have to worry anymore." The next day was Sunday, the deadline Beatrice had set for our eviction. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the front door of the estate was violently unlocked, and Beatrice, Richard, and Julian marched in, accompanied by 2 burly men in moving overalls. "Why are you things still here?" Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing through the grand hallway as she saw our half-packed boxes sitting untouched. "I told you to be gone by today." My mother and I walked down the grand staircase, completely calm and composed. "We are not leaving, Beatrice," my mother said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Richard stepped forward, his face turning red as he glared at us. "Are you deaf, Sarah? We have the legal deed to this house. These movers are here to throw your junk onto the curb. If you do not step aside, I'm calling the sheriff right now." "Go ahead, call them," a powerful voice boomed from the front entrance. Everyone turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit walking through the open double doors. He had the exact same striking blue eyes and sharp jawline as my grandfather. 2 younger associates in business suits followed close behind him, carrying thick leather briefcases. Beatrice stared at the man, her face draining of all color as she recognized the striking resemblance. "Who the hell are you?" Julian demanded, stepping forward with his hands in his pockets, trying to look intimidating. "Get out of our house." "My name is Thomas Vance," the man said, his voice calm, steady, and incredibly intimidating. Beatrice took a step back, her hands trembling as she looked from Thomas to me. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is impossible. He died years ago. You are a fraud." I stepped forward, holding up the black leather journal and the stack of letters tied with the blue ribbon. "He didn't die, Beatrice," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "Grandfather kept him safe from you. And he kept a record of every single dollar you extorted from him to buy your fancy cars and your husband's failing business." Richard's eyes went wide with panic. He grabbed Beatrice's arm, his voice shaking. "Beatrice, what is going on? What are they talking about?" Thomas stepped forward, opening one of the briefcases his associate held out. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and handed them directly to Richard. "This is a formal filing for the probate court, contesting the fraudulent will you produced," Thomas announced, his voice echoing through the foyer. We have filed a motion to freeze all of Arthur's estate assets, including the bank accounts you tried to access yesterday. Richard scrambled to look at the paperwork, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the papers. This is nonsense. This will is signed and notarized. The notary you used is a close personal friend of yours. Richard, Thomas countered, stepping closer, his presence completely dominating the room. We have already deposed him. When faced with federal charges of notary fraud and conspiracy, he sang like a bird. He has already signed an affidavit admitting you forced Arthur to sign those papers while he was completely unresponsive. Julian looked at his father, panic written all over his face. Dad, tell me this isn't true. We are supposed to get the money. I already put a down payment on the sports car. Beatrice was hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Arthur wouldn't do this, she muttered, her voice hysterical. He would never expose the affair. It would ruin his legacy. Our father's legacy is perfectly safe, Beatrice, Thomas said, his voice cold as ice. But yours is about to be utterly destroyed. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and pressed play on the video of my grandfather. The audio filled the foyer, Arthur's clear, sharp voice detailing how Beatrice had blackmailed him, how she had used her own mother's fragile health to extort millions of dollars. If you proceed with trying to evict Sarah, or if you attempt to claim a single penny of this estate, Thomas continued, this video, along with 15 years of bank records, emails, and transaction receipts, will be delivered to the district attorney and the IRS. Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray. The IRS? He whispered. Yes, Richard, Thomas smiled, a cold, predatory expression. You failed to declare over $3 million of extorted income on your tax returns over the last 15 years. That is not just a civil matter. That is federal tax evasion, money laundering, and grand larceny. You're looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The silence in the foyer was deafening. The two movers Beatrice had hired looked at each other, realized they were caught in the middle of a massive family war, and quietly slipped out the front door, leaving their dolly behind. Beatrice sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying her face in her hands. You can't do this, she sobbed. We are family. Sarah, please. Talk to him. We are sisters. My mother walked over to her sister, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and utter disgust. You stopped being my sister the moment you decided to blackmail our father while I was cleaning his bedpans and holding his hand through his night. Terrors, my mother said, her voice filled with a quiet, devastating power. You saw him as a bank account, my mother continued. I saw him as my father. You have 48 hours to pack your things and vacate the guest house on the property that you have been using as your personal vacation spot. If you ever set foot on this estate again, we will press charges immediately. Thomas stepped forward, his associates handing out another set of documents. We have also filed a civil lawsuit to recover the $3 million you extorted from Arthur's accounts over the last 15 years, Thomas added. We will be taking your house, your cars, and your shares in the family business to pay back what you stole, Thomas declared. You have 48 hours to comply, or we release the files to the federal authorities. Richard looked like he was going to have a heart attack right then and there. He grabbed Beatrice by the shoulder, dragging her toward the door. Come on, we have to go. We need a lawyer. We need to leave right now. Julian stood there, looking at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief. You ruined us, he whispered, his voice trembling. You ruined yourselves the moment you decided to be greedy, I replied, staring him down until he turned and ran out the door after his parents. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, leaving the foyer incredibly quiet. The tension that had suffocated the house for years seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a profound, beautiful peace. My mother looked at Thomas, the tears finally returning to her eyes, but this time they were tears of immense relief. She reached out, and Thomas immediately stepped forward, wrapping his arms around his older sister in a long, emotional embrace. Thank you, Thomas, my mother sobbed against his shoulder. Thank you for saving us. We are family, Sarah, Thomas whispered, his eyes shining with tears. Arthur loved you so much, and he wanted to make sure you were protected. I'm just glad I could finally help. Over the next few months, the legal storm we unleashed absolutely decimated Beatrice and her family. Realizing they had no defense and that the evidence of extortion and tax fraud was airtight, they did not even attempt to fight the lawsuit. To avoid going to federal prison, Beatrice and Richard signed over their lavish suburban mansion, their luxury vehicles, and all their remaining financial assets to the estate. The IRS still caught wind of the undeclared income, resulting in a massive audit that completely wiped out Richard's business, forcing them into bankruptcy. Julian, who had never worked a day in his life, had to drop out of his expensive university and take a minimum wage job just to help his parents pay rent on a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. They were completely ostracized from high society, their former friends wanting nothing to do with them after the details of their elder abuse and blackmail became public knowledge. Thomas, my mother, and I spent the summer getting to know each other, sharing stories of Arthur and building a beautiful, unbreakable bond. We decided to keep the estate, turning a portion of it into a foundation to support caregivers of dementia patients, ensuring Arthur's legacy of love and care would live on forever. As I sat on the porch with my mother and my new uncle, watching the sunset over the beautiful gardens, I felt a deep sense of peace. The greedy had been punished, the truth had set us free, and we had finally found the family we were always meant to be. Our newfound peace lasted for exactly 6 weeks before the black Mercedes Maybach pulled up the gravel driveway. I was in the front yard helping the landscapers map out the garden for the new foundation when the rear door of the luxury vehicle opened. Out stepped a man I had only seen in old family photographs, a towering figure with silver hair, a tailored pinstripe suit, and a gold-headed cane. It was Charles Sterling, my grandmother Eleanor's older brother and the undisputed patriarch of the wealthy Sterling dynasty. Behind him, looking smugger than ever, stood Beatrice, wearing an expensive new coat that she definitely could not afford on her own. My stomach plummeted as I realized Beatrice had found a benefactor to fund her revenge. I walked toward the porch just as my mother and Thomas stepped out of the house, alerted by the sound of the car. Charles Sterling stopped at the base of the porch steps, leaning heavily on his cane, his cold gray eyes sweeping over the grand facade of the estate with an air of disgust. "So this is where my sister's legacy is being defiled," Charles said, his voice deep, gravelly, and dripping with old money arrogance. Beatrice stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at Thomas. "That is him, Uncle Charles," she hissed. "That is the bastard child Arthur hid from all of us, and that is the man who is trying to steal the Sterling family fortune." Thomas did not flinch, his expression remaining perfectly calm as he slipped his hands into his pockets. "Mr. Sterling, I assume," Thomas said, his tone polite but entirely devoid of warmth. "I believe you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you state your business and leave before I have the sheriff remove you." Charles chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. "Private property?" he sneered, tapping his gold-headed cane against the stone step. "You are quite mistaken, young man. This house, the land it sits on, and the vast majority of the trusts Arthur controlled did not belong to him. They belonged to my sister, Eleanor, and by extension, the Sterling Family Trust." He gestured to one of his assistants, who immediately stepped forward and handed Thomas a thick legal folder bound in blue leather. "We have filed an emergency injunction in the state Supreme Court," Charles announced, "under the terms of the original 1960 marriage trust established by my father for Eleanor. Any assets brought into the marriage or purchased with Sterling funds are subject to a strict morality clause." Charles looked at my mother with a cold, disappointing gaze that made her flinch. "If Arthur committed adultery and fathered an illegitimate child, the entire trust, including this estate, immediately reverts back to the Sterling family," Charles explained. "Arthur had no legal right to bequeath this house to anyone, let alone his bastard son and a daughter who is harboring him." My mother gripped the porch railing, her knuckles turning white. "Uncle Charles, please," she pleaded. My mother Eleanor loved this house, and she loved Arthur despite his flaws. You cannot do this. Your mother was a sterling, Sarah, and she would be spinning in her grave if she knew you were siding with the son of her husband's mistress. Charles snapped. You have 5 days to vacate this property before federal marshals arrive, to lock the gates, and seize every asset inside. Beatrice stepped closer to the porch, a venomous smile spreading across her face as she looked up at my mother. I told you I would get what is mine, Sarah, she whispered. You thought you could ruin me, but you forgot that we have real power on our side. You and your pet lawyer are going to end up on the street where you belong. Before I could lose my temper and drag Beatrice off the property myself, Thomas stepped in front of us. We will see you in court, mister. Sterling, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. I suggest you prepare your legal team, because I'm going to make sure this backfires on you in ways you cannot possibly comprehend. Charles simply smirked, turning back toward his luxury vehicle without another word. Beatrice gave us one last triumphant look before sliding into the passenger seat, and the Maybach slowly rolled down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The moment they were gone, we retreated into the study, the atmosphere heavy with a new, terrifying tension. My mother sat on the leather sofa, her head in her hands, while Thomas paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, reading through the injunction documents. Is what he said true, Thomas? I asked, my heart pounding. Can they really take the house because of a clause from 1960? Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. Technically, yes, he admitted, looking up from the paperwork. The Sterling family trust was incredibly powerful, and back in the 60s, wealthy families used these kinds of morality clauses to protect their fortunes from cheating spouses. If Charles can prove that this estate was purchased using funds from Eleanor's family trust, and we have already admitted that I am Arthur's son from an affair, the court might rule in their favor. My mother looked up, her eyes red from crying. But Eleanor knew about you, Thomas, she said suddenly. Thomas stopped pacing, staring at my mother in surprise. What did you say, Sarah? My mother stood up, walking over to the bookshelves and pulling down an old, dusty photo album that she had saved from Beatrice's clutches weeks ago. She opened it to the very back, where a small envelope was taped to the cardboard page. A few years before she died, Eleanor called me into her room. My mother explained, her voice trembling with emotion. She was very weak, but her mind was perfectly clear. She told me that she had discovered Arthur's secret decades ago, but she chose to stay with him because they had built a life together, and she didn't want to cause a public scandal. My mother pulled a small, folded piece of paper from the envelope and handed it to Thomas. She told me she had written something down and hidden it, but she was too afraid of Charles to ever speak of it openly, my mother said. She knew Charles would use it to destroy Arthur if he ever found out. Thomas unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the elegant, faded handwriting of our grandmother, Eleanor. I watched his face closely, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw a look of pure, unadulterated shock cross his features. Leo, we need to go to the attic right now, Thomas said, his voice tight with excitement. We rushed up the stairs to the dusty, third-floor attic, which was filled with decades of Eleanor's personal belongings. There were trunks of old clothing, antique furniture wrapped in sheets, and dozens of boxes labeled with her name. According to this note, Eleanor kept a private safe hidden behind the cedar paneling in her old sewing room corner, Thomas explained. Shine his flashlight into the dark corners of the attic. We searched for nearly an hour, pulling away heavy boxes of old sewing patterns and dusty fabrics. Finally, behind a loose sheet of cedar paneling, I spotted the corner of a small, antique iron safe with a combination dial. Do you have a combination? I asked, my breath catching in my throat. Thomas looked at the note in his hand. Eleanor wrote it down in a riddle based on her wedding anniversary, he said. He carefully turned the dial, his fingers precise as he aligned the numbers. On the final turn, a heavy metallic click echoed through the quiet attic. Thomas pulled the heavy iron door open, revealing a stack of neatly organized documents, a leather-bound diary, and a small, sealed legal envelope. We carried the contents downstairs to the dining room table, where the light was better. Thomas opened the leather-bound diary first, flipping through the pages written by Eleanor during the 1980s. As we read her words, a completely different story of my grandparents' marriage began to emerge. Eleanor had not been a victim. She was an incredibly smart, independent woman who had realized very early on that her marriage to Arthur was a business transaction arranged by her brother Charles. Charles forced me into this marriage to gain control of Arthur's real estate holdings. Eleanor had written in an entry dated 1985. He has been using my family trust to manipulate Arthur for years. But I have discovered Arthur's secret son, Thomas, and I feel nothing but pity for the boy. He is innocent, and he deserves a life free from the poison of the Sterling family. More importantly, Eleanor had secretly consulted her own personal attorney, a man who had since passed away, but whose firm was still active. In the sealed legal envelope, we found an official, notarized amendment to the Eleanor Sterling Trust, dated 1992. Under the terms of the amendment, Eleanor had explicitly waived the morality and infidelity clauses of her trust, stating that she fully forgave Arthur and wished for his heirs, regardless of their parentage, to be protected. She had also written a direct message to her brother Charles, which was attached to the document. Charles, if you're reading this, it means you have attempted to use my name and my trust to destroy Arthur's family after my death, the letter read. I have spent my entire life being controlled by your greed. I will not allow you to do it from beyond the grave. But that was not all. At the bottom of the safe lay another folder, labeled with Charles Sterling's name in Eleanor's handwriting. Inside were financial statements, bank routing numbers, and internal memos from the Sterling family offices dating back 20 years. My grandmother had been keeping a detailed record of her brother's financial activities. As a Sterling, she had access to the family's offshore accounts and trust funds, and she had discovered that Charles had been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from her personal trust to cover up massive losses in his European real estate developments. Thomas stared at the financial documents, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "This is incredible," he whispered, looking up at us. Charles didn't file this lawsuit to protect Eleanor's legacy. He filed it because he is desperate. "What do you mean, Thomas?" my mother asked. Thomas pointed to the financial statements from the last 2 years. "Charles's real estate empire in Europe is completely collapsing," Thomas explained. "He is on the verge of bankruptcy, and he needs the assets in this estate and Eleanor's trust to pay off his predatory lenders. If he can invalidate Arthur's will and seize this property, he can use it as collateral to save his own skin. And Beatrice is just his pawn," I added, realizing the depth of the betrayal. "Exactly," Thomas nodded. "Charles probably promised Beatrice a small cut of the estate if she helped him destroy us. And she was too stupid and greedy to realize he was using her to commit massive financial fraud." Thomas stood up, gathering the documents and placing them carefully back into his briefcase. "We have a deposition scheduled in 3 days at Charles's high-rise office downtown," he said, his eyes flashing with a fierce determination. "I want both of you to be there. We're going to let them think they have us cornered, and then we're going to bury them." The next 3 days were a blur of intense preparation. Thomas worked around the clock with his legal team, pulling tax records, verifying the authenticity of Eleanor's trust amendment, and preparing a trap that would completely dismantle the Sterling family empire. On the morning of the deposition, we arrived at the massive glass and steel skyscraper that housed the Sterling family offices. The conference room on the 50th floor was opulent, with panoramic views of the city, a massive mahogany table, and leather chairs. Charles Sterling sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 high-priced corporate defense attorneys. Beatrice sat next to him, wearing a smug, arrogant expression, her husband Richard sitting quietly behind her looking nervous. Thomas, my mother, and I took our seats on the opposite side of the table. Thomas calmly opened his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it in the center of the table. "Let us get this over with," Charles said, leaning forward and resting his hands on his gold-headed cane. "We are prepared to offer you a settlement, Sarah, if you sign over the deed to the estate and agree to waive all claims to Eleanor's trust, we will allow you to keep $500,000. And we will decline to press charges against your brother for fraudulent occupation of the property." Beatrice smirked, leaning forward. "You should take the deal, Sarah. It is more than a bastard and his accomplice deserve." Thomas did not look at Beatrice. He kept his eyes locked on a Charles Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, before we discuss any settlements, I would like to enter several documents in the record," Thomas said, his voice incredibly calm and professional. He slid the first document across the table. "This is a copy of the Eleanor Sterling Trust Amendment, drafted and notarized in 1992, Thomas announced. Charles's lead attorney frowned, picking up the document and scanning it. As he read, his face slowly turned pale, and he leaned over to whisper urgently in Charles's ear. "What is that?" Beatrice demanded, her smile faltering as she saw the panic on the lawyer's face. "Uncle Charles, what is going on?" Charles waved his hand dismissively, though his eyes narrowed as he stared at Thomas. "A cheap forgery," Charles muttered. "My sister would never sign such a thing. We have already verified the notary's signature and the registration of this amendment with the state," Thomas countered, his voice steady. "Under the terms of this legally binding amendment, Eleanor explicitly waived all morality and infidelity clauses. The estate and the trust assets are completely secure, and your lawsuit has absolutely no legal basis." Charles slammed his cane against the floor. "Even if that document is real, Eleanor's trust was funded by Sterling money. I am a trustee of the Sterling family, and I have the right to manage those assets." Thomas smiled, a slow, cold expression that made Charles's attorneys look even more terrified. "That brings me to my second exhibit, Mr. Sterling," Thomas said, sliding a second, much thicker folder across the table. "Inside this folder, you will find 20 years of financial transactions from the Sterling family offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." Thomas explained, his voice echoing through the silent conference room. Charles froze, his hand tightening around his cane until his knuckles turned blue. "According to these records, which were meticulously kept by your sister Eleanor, you have embezzled over $12 million from her personal trust over the last 2 decades, Thomas declared, leaning forward and looking directly into Charles's eyes. "You transferred those funds to your shell companies in Luxembourg to cover up the massive losses in your European real estate developments." Thomas continued, "That is federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Beatrice looked from Charles to Thomas, her face turning pale as she realized the tide had completely turned. "Uncle Charles?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Is this true?" "Shut up, Beatrice," Charles snapped, his voice suddenly sounding weak and raspy. Thomas did not stop. "We have already sent these financial records, along with Eleanor's original diary entries detailing your embezzlement, to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Southern District of New York," Thomas announced. Charles's lead attorney immediately closed his folder and stood up. "Mr. Sterling, we need to stop this deposition immediately," the attorney said, his voice trembling. "We need to consult with criminal defense counsel." "No," Charles muttered, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at Thomas. "What do you want?" Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, looking completely in control of the room. "This is what is going to happen, Mr. Sterling," Thomas said, his voice like iron. "First, you're going to sign a formal, irrevocable withdrawal of your lawsuit against Sarah and me, with prejudice, meaning you can never file it again," Thomas commanded. "Second, you're going to resign as trustee of the Sterling family trusts, handing over complete control to Sarah and myself," Thomas continued. "We will manage the assets to ensure Eleanor's actual wishes are carried out, and we will use the remaining funds to support the caregiving foundation we have established." Charles's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "And if I refuse?" "If you refuse, the federal authorities will be waiting for you downstairs by the time you reach the lobby," Thomas replied coldly. "You will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary, and your family's name will be permanently dragged through the mud." Charles looked at his lead attorney, desperately seeking a way out. The attorney simply shook his head, looking down at the table. "There is nothing we can do, Charles," the lawyer whispered. "They have the bank records. It is over." A soft, choked sob escaped from Beatrice's throat. She looked at Charles, her voice hysterical. "What about my money? You promised me $5 million if I helped you get this house. You said we would be rich again." Charles turned on her, his face twisted in absolute fury. "You stupid, greedy girl," he roared, slamming his cane onto the table, shattering a glass of water. "You dragged me into this. If you hadn't been so obsessed with ruining your sister, I would have never looked into Arthur's estate, and they would have never found Eleanor's safe. You ruined us." Richard, Beatrice's husband, finally stood up, his face filled with a mixture of terror and disgust. "I told you to leave them alone, Beatrice," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I told you we should have just accepted the bankruptcy. Now we're going to prison because of your greed." He turned and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the heavy glass door behind him. Julian, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looked at his mother with a face full of utter despair before slowly following his father out of the room. Beatrice collapsed in her chair, weeping hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. No one in the room comforted her. Charles Sterling slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and signed the legal document Thomas's associate slid in front of him. His hand shook so violently that the signature was barely legible. He slid the paper back to Thomas, stood up slowly, and walked out of the conference room, leaning heavily on his cane, looking like a broken, old man who had lost everything. Thomas picked up the signed document, checking the signature before handing it to our mother. "Is officially over, Sarah," Thomas said softly. "The house is yours, the trust is yours, and no one can ever threaten us again." My mother held the paper to her chest, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face as she looked at Thomas. "We did it," she whispered. "We finally did it." I looked at Beatrice, who was still sitting at the table, completely abandoned by her family and her wealthy uncle. "You should leave, Beatrice," I said, my voice completely devoid of pity. "You have 48 hours to pack your remaining things from the guest house, just like we said. If you ever come back, we will have you arrested for trespassing." Beatrice did not say a word. She slowly stood up, clutching her purse, and walked out of the conference room with her head bowed. Her reign of terror and greed finally brought to a humiliating end. In the weeks that followed, the destruction of the Sterling dynasty was swift and absolute. Charles Sterling was forced to step down from all his corporate positions, and his real estate empire collapsed into a massive, highly publicized bankrupt, while his age and failing health ultimately spared him from a lengthy prison sentence. He was forced to pay millions in restitution, stripping him of his wealth and leaving him a disgraced recluse in a tiny retirement home, completely forgotten by the high society he had once dominated. Beatrice and Richard's marriage completely fell apart under the pressure of their financial ruin and the impending tax evasion charges against Richard. They divorced, and Beatrice was forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated apartment, working as a retail clerk just to survive. She tried to contact my mother several times to beg for money, but my mother had blocked her number and changed her email, completely shutting her sister out of her life forever. Julian was forced to take on multiple manual labor jobs to pay off the debts his parents had accumulated in his name. The spoiled, arrogant cousin who had once threatened to throw us onto the street was now exhausted. Broke young man who had to work 60 hours a week just to afford groceries. Meanwhile, the Arthur and Eleanor Foundation blossomed. We renovated a large portion of the estate, turning it into a beautiful, peaceful sanctuary for families dealing with the devastating effects of dementia. We hired top-tier medical professionals, social workers, and therapists to provide free counseling and support groups, ensuring that no caregiver would ever have to suffer the isolation and exhaustion that my mother had endured for 10 years. Thomas became a permanent fixture in our lives, visiting us every month and taking an active role in running the foundation. He was no longer just the secret son from a hidden letter. He was my uncle, my mother's brother, and our closest ally. One beautiful Saturday evening, we held the grand opening of the Foundation's new wing. The gardens were lit with hundreds of soft, glowing fairy lights, and the air was filled with the beautiful sounds of a classical string quartet. Dozens of families, medical professionals, and community leaders walked through the beautiful gardens, laughing, talking, and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. I stood on the back porch, watching my mother stand next to Thomas. She was laughing, her face glowing with a happiness and peace that I had not seen in over a decade. The heavy burden of grief, fear, and betrayal had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Thomas walked over to me, holding a glass of champagne, and looked out over the crowded garden. "We did a good thing here, Leo," he said softly, clinking his glass against mine. "Yes, we did," I replied, looking at the beautiful legacy we had created from the ashes of a painful secret. Grandfather and grandmother would be incredibly proud of what we did. Thomas smiled, looking up at the starry night sky. "I think they are, Leo," he said. "I think they finally are." As the music drifted through the warm summer night and the laughter of the guests echoed through the gardens, I knew that our family had finally found our true home, built not on secrets and greed, but on love, truth, and an unbreakable bond that no one could ever tear apart again.